Welcome, everyone. You are listening to Third Space Thoughts to Policy, the official podcast of IIIT, the International Institute of Islamic Thought, part of its Advancing Education in Muslim Societies program, otherwise known as AIMS. We are delighted to have Ms. Meena Srinivasan on the program with us today to talk about gratitude. Meena Srinivasan, MA, a National Board Certified Teacher, is a South Asian American entrepreneur with deep expertise in the fields of social and emotional learning, otherwise known as SEL, and mindfulness in education. She is the founding executive director of Transformative Educational Leadership, TEL, an empowering racially and culturally diverse, compassion-centered, innovative program for educational leaders who are called to integrate mindfulness-based, social, emotional, academic, and ethical learning into schools and school systems. Prior to this role, she spent 5.5 years working in partnership with the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, CASEL, to implement SEL system-wide in the Oakland Unified School District. Meena has taught and led in a variety of school settings, public, private, urban, international, and is the creator of the SEL Everyday online courses, author of Teach, Breathe, Learn, Mindfulness in and Out of the Classroom, and SEL Everyday, integrating SEL with instruction in secondary classrooms, which was chosen as one of 2019's favorite books for educators by the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley. So welcome, Meena, to the program. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Happy to be here with you, Amina.
Wonderful, wonderful. We're delighted to have you today and so excited, and we're going to go ahead and dive into the questions that we have for you. So our first question for you is that gratitude and mindfulness are the focus of your work and publications. They are also trendy in schools these days, and definitely we need them in these unusual times. Will you share with our audience your take on those concepts and what they mean to you?
Sure. Well, I'm going to start with talking a little bit about mindfulness, because mindfulness has become this huge buzzword, right? I mean, you see all these mindful magazines at the grocery store, and it's really kind of exploded in the past few years, and it's come into healthcare, corporate world, and also in education, which is my field. And I want to offer a deeper way of understanding mindfulness today. And so often when we hear the word mindfulness, we talk about just being present or breathing or being calm, but it's really so much more than that. And I think now in particular, in these uncertain times, I think of mindfulness as really cultivating our capacity to hold greater complexity, right? We're literally through this practice of really, cultivating not only present moment awareness, but this sense of a greater interconnection with all beings, with all aspects of our planet. We're enhancing our nervous system, and we're enhancing our nervous system to be able to hold greater complexity and greater uncertainty, which is precisely what we need to be doing right now in this era of the dual pandemics. At least I'm talking as someone who lives in the United States, with the global pandemic of COVID-19, but also with this critical call for real racial justice. And so I define mindfulness. I'm going to offer you my definition here. It has a couple parts, and it's evolved over the years, but I define it as paying attention to our inner and outer life as it unfolds while being grounded in our body, our breathing, and our senses, so that our mind can settle and we can cultivate a curious, open-hearted presence and awareness of interbeing. Now, this term interbeing may be new for a lot of folks, and so I want to just lift up that this term interbeing was coined by Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, who, for those of you that don't know who he is or haven't heard this name before, he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and he's a Vietnamese global spiritual leader. And interbeing means to enter dependently coexist. And it honors the interdependence of every person to all other persons and aspects of our planet. And, Martin Luther King talked about beloved community, and the sense of beloved community really extends to our relationship with the planet. So interbeing is critical because it really is the foundation when we're thinking about and really trying to understand mindfulness in this way of really, being able to understand and hold greater complexity. And in a beautiful illustration of interbeing, Thich Nhat Hanh writes that if you were a poet, you would see clearly that there is a cloud floating in a sheet of paper. Without the cloud, there would be no rain. Without the rain, there would be no trees. And without the trees, there would be no paper. The cloud is essential for the paper to exist. If the cloud is not there, the paper cannot be there either. And he goes on to write that if you look deeply enough, you can see the logger who cut down the trees and the logger's ancestors as well in this sheet of paper. So what Thich Nhat Hanh is really pointing us to is a paradigm shift. It's a shift from really viewing things as extraction, but really shifting towards an interbeing consciousness. And the nonviolent movements of Mahatma Gandhi and of Dr. Martin Luther King really rested on the sense of interbeing. Dr. King once wrote that in a real sense, all life is interrelated. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. This is the interrelated structure of reality. And so mindfulness really has to be engaged. And when we think of mindfulness in this day and age, it's like we're cultivating our inner resources, we're deepening our awareness of interconnection, and we're, deepening our capacity to really look at things at this deeper level. But once there is this seeing, Thich Nhat Hanh talks about how there must also be acting. Otherwise, what's the use of seeing? So this sense of really having our action and engagement in the world coming from this deep inner sense of our interconnection. So if I know that my actions, we've seen it like with the pandemic at another level, right? How our actions impact others. If we know that in the deepest way, then how could we not, act with kindness and act with compassion? Because in a way, we literally are, deeply affecting and inhabiting each other's lives. And so that's just a little bit about, how I define mindfulness. And we can go a lot deeper and talk a little more about, some practices. And you also invited me to talk a little bit about gratitude. And I think gratitude is very much connected to mindfulness. And for me, I define gratitude as really taking time to intentionally notice, feel, and appreciate what you're thankful for. And a daily gratitude practice, I believe it's Dr. Bob Emmons at UC Davis has done a lot of work around this. And apparently a daily practice of gratitude where you intentionally notice, feel, and appreciate what you're thankful for can increase your happiness by 25%. But it's not just like, naming to yourself, oh, I'm grateful for this, I'm grateful. It's really feeling and really just kind of connecting with what it feels like to be in the state of appreciation for the things in your life that you're grateful for. And I have an exercise that I can share a little later that I love to do every day to really support a gratitude practice. But I think now, particularly in our pandemic context, there's many things that we don't normally, we don't have access to in the same way. It's a profound opportunity for us to really deepen our gratitude practice and really recognize what brings us joy and to really have that practice of gratitude be deliberate.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much, Meena. I think that your definition for mindfulness is very, very fascinating, especially when you went into interbeing and our interdependence. And I really appreciate that when you talk about gratitude, you talk about how there is an intentional component there, so that it's intentionally practicing or reminding ourselves of things that we're thankful for, and not just listing them, like you said, but feeling like the emotional aspect of that as well. And that's a great way for us to go into our next question for you, because as a teacher yourself, you encourage cultivating mindfulness and promoting SEL, which is socio-emotional learning, in the classroom. To what extent do you recommend that gratitude be incorporated in the formal and non-formal curriculum? And what are some strategies you recommend for teaching gratitude to various age groups?
Sure. Well, when I was a classroom teacher, I've been, was an administrator for 5 years, and now I run a national educational nonprofit that does leadership capacity building. But gratitude for me has always been a key practice, a key contemplative practice. And why don't I just share one practice for folks who may be listening to the podcast that I love to do and that I've used with children, adults, really folks across age, but it's a wonderful way to practice gratitude. And I first learned it from my husband, who was taking an Awakening Joy course with James Braz. And one of the guest teachers was a woman by the name of Linda Graham, who's done a lot of research around compassion. So I would say to deliberately practice gratitude, a great entry point is this exercise where you set aside time daily, and you first start off with thinking about all the nouns you are grateful for. So this is great when kids are learning about nouns and adjectives. But start
Right.
off with like the nouns that you are grateful for. And as you list each one, really feeling them in your body. So, I had some strawberries this morning. And so I'm reliving this experience of like those fresh strawberries. And when I'm bringing the interbeing element into it, right, I'm also thinking about, well, I got those strawberries from a farmer's market, and I remember the farmer who sold those strawberries to me, and then I'm thinking about the sun and the soil and these infinite causes and conditions that resulted in the strawberry, being in my bowl this morning. And it's like, wow, it's a miracle, and I can literally feel that sense in my body. So you start off by not just listing the nouns, but, you write them down, but you really feel them. And then you'd go on to adjectives that you are grateful for. And the same thing, really feeling them. If it's accessible, bringing in that element of kind of recognizing this interbeing reality of how nothing exists independently, right? And that we are a product of infinite causes and conditions. And then finally, what I call the web of life. So the web of life is, the folks that you are grateful for in your life, from the people that might be picking up your trash, or when you're, going grocery shopping. Gosh, those folks who are braving it, who are going to the grocery store, who often, I want to name a lot of our essential workers in our country are from communities of color. And so really thinking about those folks who are part of your web of life that make your life possible. Sometimes they're seen, sometimes they're unseen, but bringing them to mind. And when we do that daily, we cultivate a state of appreciation. And I think actually that the state of appreciation and gratitude is one of the most powerful states that we can cultivate in ourselves. And it's also really powerful because, my teacher Thich Nhat Hanh says, there's always conditions for happiness. Sometimes you have to look deeply. So even when things in your life are really tough, really, really difficult, if we look deeply enough, there's something that we can find gratitude for, something that we're breathing, that we're alive, And so orienting ourselves in this way is powerful, and it's a powerful thing to teach to young people. And it's something I've started in my own way, kind of sharing and imparting with my son, being present, which is an aspect of mindfulness, enables us to really recognize the moments where we're grateful, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. I really love how you've explained that. We start off being grateful for nouns, and then the adjectives, and then the web of life, all the different wonderful ways that people have come into our lives and just made it better. And I'm so glad also that you highlighted the role of our essential workers and the really important role that they've played during this pandemic, and to our health workers. And like you said, even in a challenging time, it's at those times where it's even more important to focus on what we're grateful for so that we can increase our happiness. Like you mentioned in Dr. Eamon's work, that the more grateful you are, it's linked to being, I think you said like 25%
Happier. Of course, my father-in-law, who's a scientist, was like, I want to know how they're measuring that.
It's always the golden question, how one is measuring these
Yeah. Well,
items.
I'm not a researcher, but I can say from my lived experience that when I orient myself in that way of really cultivating this sense of gratitude or being in a more appreciative state, I'm a lot happier. And therefore, I'm then sharing that happiness state with my family, with my friends, with my colleagues, and it's like a ripple, right? It spreads.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree with you. It reminds me of my days teaching Sunday school at a mosque here in Northern Virginia. And one of our lessons was on gratitude, one of our many lessons. And we talked about how in the Quran it mentions that when you are grateful towards God, then God will increase you in what you have. So the idea here is that you increase your state of happiness and goodness the more grateful you are. And I did notice that just on a personal level, that whenever we in the classroom, we would practice, myself and the students, thinking about what we're grateful for and who we appreciate in our lives. And it just, you could feel the positive spirit in the room increase because of that.
Appreciation appreciates, right?
Absolutely.
Appreciates, it gets bigger. And, a common social and emotional learning practice actually is that we end our class with appreciations, where you appreciate another classmate, for something they said, something you learned. And, and then there is an energetic shift in the space, in the classroom. And I usually end my meetings often with appreciations. And that's how you create connection and community, through these informal and more informal ways of practicing gratitude.
Definitely.
And I mean, one other thing I love that you shared about your experience teaching in Sunday school, and one thing I just want to name, in the U.S. when we are, in public schools where, there is this separation of church and state, I think one of the things that we have to really think about is like, what are secular ethics then? And what are these, like, I think about social and emotional learning as the skills we need for not just life success, because that's very individualistic, but for societal success, right?
Yes.
So we have to, because and a lot of folks aren't necessarily being taught these values at home, or, or they may not be going to a Sunday school where they're being taught, some of these values or these skills and competencies. And so it's really important that we prioritize them, because ultimately, when we talk about social emotional learning, there's several frameworks out there. The framework that I've worked with a lot is one that comes from the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning, and the competencies are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, responsible decision-making, and relationship skills. And these are the competencies that we need to be happy and to create, not just happy, but like a productive, happy, successful life, individually and collectively. So I just thank you for mentioning that, because it reminded me, like when I was growing up, anything that I learned in that realm really came from the home. We weren't explicitly taught a lot of these skills and competencies in school, more implicitly. And, when I do trainings, I joke around and I'd say, okay, so where did we learn these skills, the competencies I named of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. And I had one woman stand up and she said, oh, in my 3 marriages, I mean divorces, and everyone laughed. But the reality is, right, is that marriage relationships require us to have such a profound level of social and emotional skills if you're going to create, a successful, happy marriage. And we have to be taught these competencies, because if we're not, we're just really not really setting young people up to have the most successful lives that they can.
True. Yeah, it's so important for young people to learn these skills. And it's important for young people, but I also wonder for adults, and that kind of leads into our next question for you, which is, do the same methods for cultivating gratitude in children work for adults? And is it ever too late to start strengthening one's sense of gratitude?
You bet. It's like never, well, the same strategies work for the most part. And, our brains change. Our brains can change. There's something called
Mm-hmm.
neuroplasticity, right? And
Right.
so we can absolutely change with deliberate practice. But again, this is, deliberate practice. So, we have to kind of deliberately prioritize cultivating these states in ourselves. And there's so many ways in which we can do that. And, I wanted to just take a moment and, we haven't talked about negativity bias, but essentially, negativity bias is it's evolutionary. We're designed to privilege the negative so we could survive over the years, but now we live in a different context. But we have to kind of almost rewire our brain, and actually for every negative thought or negative experience, counter it with 5. And the way we do that is, I often talk about touching, soaking, and savoring in joy. So really for like 30 seconds, if there's something that brings you joy, to
That's really
really,
beautiful.
really feel it, whether it's hugging your child, to just feel it and be with it. My husband and I, and then my son and I, we do 3 breath hugs. And this also comes from Thich Nhat Hanh, where you're just present with the person. And this might sound kind of morbid, but on the first breath, I say to myself, I'm not going to be here in this form forever. On the second breath, you're not going to be here in this form forever. And on the third breath, so let us cherish this time that we have, and so in an instant, these micro kind of practices can be brought into our lives so we can live in a more present, appreciative, grateful, joyful state. So yeah, I would say, the majority of my work actually over now, 8 years has been working with adults. So I was an educator for many years. I'm still an educator, but then I worked in the central office of a large urban school district. And our theory of action really focused on adult social and emotional learning, because you can't teach what you don't have. Right. And so we really focused on the teachers and the leaders. And now I run an organization that focuses, we work exclusively with leaders around cultivating, emotionally intelligent educational leaders across sector. So we have educational leaders in the nonprofit world, working in school districts as superintendents, school principals. And it's also an incredibly diverse group. I was sharing with you earlier, it's 60% leaders of color. And we really feel that that's very important.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, because, we are the global majority, and it's important for us to have learning spaces where that's reflected, and where we can really unpack things like all of the ways in which white supremacy really consciously and unconsciously is alive and well in our organizations and in our institutions. I'll just pause there.
I think it's really important that you highlight that, Meena. And I agree that it's very much important to see spaces of leadership become more diverse. And part of being mindful and being conscientious is taking action, like you were talking about earlier, that it's not just enough to be aware, but also to take action. And when people have the time to reflect on the injustices that are within their own society, then they are better equipped to take action and change it and make it better. And so eradicating various social ills, including white supremacy, will take a collective conscientiousness and intentions by many people to actively make a difference in our daily lives. So to really have equity. So our next question for you is that your book, Teach, Breathe, Learn, Mindfulness in and Out of the Classroom, was one of the first books to be published on mindfulness in education according to your website. Interestingly, Part 2 offers techniques for cultivating loving kindness, gratitude, and seeing others as oneself. Can you share with us more of these techniques? And what are the most important steps we need to take when we feel discouraged and stuck, especially now in the COVID-19 era?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing that I want to lift up is, well, that book was written in 2014, or came out in 2014, and it was part of this sort of first wave of these mindfulness and education books for teachers. And I think what was unique about it is that a lot of the books are written by psychologists or folks from the outside, but it was really written from my perspective of someone who had been in the front lines in the classroom, really trying to do this work on the ground with young people. And I want to just name that this is a hard time, and that self-compassion is really important. And what I mean by self-compassion is just being kind to ourselves, practicing self-kindness. And the way I do that is really just acknowledging, like saying to myself, this is a hard moment. And then I do a practice where I literally embrace myself as I breathe. And, you know, my teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, he talks about how we are the crying baby, but we also have the capacity to be the mother to soothe the crying baby. Mm-hmm. And so we play both of those roles. And when I think about self-compassion and loving kindness and really caring for ourselves, I think about that image, especially now as a mother, you know, and how I soothe my son when he gets a boo-boo, when he's upset, and how I have the capacity to soothe myself and to heal myself. And
that's very powerful.
Yeah, I think just like really recognizing that, hey, this is a hard moment, and that's okay, because it's hard for everyone. And when we acknowledge that it's hard for everyone, we tap into that sense of our common humanity, right? And it also reminds us that, you know, at the end of the day, everybody just, you know, doesn't want to suffer. Right. And that reminds me of just, you know, like seeing ourselves as others, or like putting ourselves in each other's shoes. I mean, gosh, it's probably the most powerful practice in my marriage that I, you know, even need to go deeper with. But like, before I speak, can I put myself in my husband's position? What is he experiencing? You know, what was his, you know, and we always look at things through our lens, but if we tried to look at it through another's lens, through how they're experiencing it, we'll have greater compassion and greater capacity to actually be in relationship. And so, you know, when I was in the classroom, I used to do something just really like a short practice, you know, before I'd start my class, you know, when I was teaching middle schoolers, and I used to connect back to like when I was in middle school, and it would put me in the mindset of like, of course they think that's funny. Of course they're rebelling. I was the same, you know, I remember when I was an adolescent. And so there's ways in which we can get creative, but I think the intention is really around how can we see something from another person's perspective. And I think especially now, it's very important for me, you know, as a non-Black person of color, to really try and understand what my Black brothers and sisters are experiencing, have experienced. And I really see the practice of me trying my best to put myself in their position, it moves me into action. And I really see my role as a non-Black person of color committed to justice, as someone that is committed to really easing the burden on my Black brothers and sisters. So if that means, you know, playing the role of being the bridge between them and white people in my work and my organization, and having hard conversations when I need to, I do that. But it's really coming from this place of like, I don't want anyone to suffer, and I want everyone to grow their compassion, whether you're white, whether you're whatever. I want everyone to grow our compassion and grow our capacity to really kind of see, feel, and experience things from other people's perspective. I think that's so important.
I completely agree with you, Meena. And I think that you said it all so well. And something else that I appreciated that you mentioned earlier is the importance of repetition too. So it's not just that we say, oh, we're going to be mindful or grateful for a day, and then that's it. We're magically really, really grateful or really, really mindful. There is a process involved here where there's repetition, and to try to do it daily and be intentional about that. And
for sure.
And there are ways to do that in a secular manner. And there's also ways that happens in faith traditions. Like I'm going back to when I taught Sunday school, but when we taught about the 5 daily prayers to the students and teaching them the meaning of one of the surahs or chapters of the Quran that they're reciting, the aya, part of it, it's expressing gratitude. And so understanding what one is saying also plays a role there in really feeling what you're saying. And
Totally.
And repetition, again, it's because sometimes people think, oh, okay, well, a repetition, it's just a habit, but there are some habits that will have really, really excellent impacts on your state of being and your well-being, like practicing intentional gratitude and mindfulness to better be able to take the perspective of others and feel for the suffering of others. Like you were talking about, Meena, it's one of the great things, the idea of being more empathetic, being more mindful, is that people through their human development would become less egocentric, less ethnocentric, less identifying just within whichever identity group they were born into, but being able to see through the eyes of people from other communities, to be able to see the perspective of other marginalized groups, to be a better ally, to actually make a better difference, to be a better listener, and to be able to communicate better as well, and to really be there.
Yeah, I think you said it really beautifully, Amina, and it reminds me of something I heard last week. We did a retreat for educators, and one of the leaders in our program, an African-American elder, really put out the question around performance versus practice. And so, you know, when something is something we perform or we say we're doing versus like real deliberate practice that results in transformation, right? Of our inner states, of our inner lives. And I think also there are definitely ways to do this either in a faith-based way or in a secular way. And one thing I wanted to mention is that, you know, all traditions, religious traditions, you know, indigenous wisdom traditions, there are forms of contemplation, right? And, you know, what has been popularized in the West is kind of a secularized version of mindfulness from, you know, Buddhist wisdom tradition, but it's been taken out of cultural context. So things like interbeing are not a part of, you know, how people commonly, you know, or you get stuff like do mindfulness to get you the edge, you know, where that intention, that right intention isn't there, right? So I think when you take some of these practices out of that cultural or religious container, you lose something. And so we have to just recognize that as we're engaging in some of these practices, and there's a lot of science to back it up, that a lot of these practices are coming from a time and a place and a space where our intention was really less about, you know, being successful or getting everything right for me, but really it's about the community, right? And so I think it's important for us to even orient ourselves in that way. And there's folks who talk about relational mindfulness or community mindfulness. And I think that given the state of our world now, that's definitely the direction that we have to move in. And it starts with us, right? It starts in our homes.
Absolutely.
You know, it starts in our families. It starts in our, you know, particular workplaces. And that's how we grow movement, and that's how we affect change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today, Meena. Thank you so much. And we look forward to keeping in touch, and we cheer on all your current and future endeavors.
Thank you. Take care.
To stay up to date on everything happening with the Advancing Education in Muslim Societies program, otherwise known as AIMS, please follow IIIT on Twitter at IIITFriends and Instagram at IIIT_Insta. You can listen to this podcast on Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, iTunes, or Apple Podcasts, CastBox, and Messy FM, as well as Podcast Mirror. The observations and conclusions featured in this podcast represent the speaker's own personal views, not the organization's. If you have any questions for us or would like to join the conversation, please reach out to me. My email is amina@iiit.org. Our team here will pick a few of the top questions to feature in the season finale, so let us know your name and where you're asking from, and we will be sure to gather that information for you from the experts. Our season finale will come out sometime this fall. More details are coming soon. In the meanwhile, for the next few weeks, we recommend that you listen to episodes 25 through 37 of the podcast, which covered the topics of empathy, hope, forgiveness, sense of belonging, meaning-making, gratitude, self-regulation, and how these all relate to the Mapping the Terrain study. As always, we look forward to working together towards transformative education, advancing holistic human development. Thank you all for listening. Salam.